way through the Jefferson administration, we had elected Madison in 1808. But when we elected Madison in 1808, we said that he comes into office with a problem. And the problem is establishing U.S. neutrality. That the British and the French were locked in this titanic struggle, which, is Napoleonic Wars. The British, with their domination of the seas, was trying to prevent us from trading with their enemies. And so they had resumed the practices that bothered us. And one of them in particular was impressment. And so Jefferson tries to deal with this with the Embargo Act. Madison is elected and tries to deal with this as well. There's a fair amount of frustration in the country. And so in 1810, the public votes in an entirely new Congress. Well, I shouldn't say entirely, a significantly new Congress that includes a faction of young Republicans that are mostly from the South and the West that identify themselves as war hawks. This faction, we said, was led by Henry Clay. Henry Clay of Kentucky comes into Congress in 1810. He is elected Speaker of the House of Representatives as a freshman. This is a big deal. And Clay is an advocate for taking aggressive action against Britain. Now, interestingly enough, and we made this point too, that these war hawks were often not from areas that were coastal. In other words, they had no little interest in freedom of the seas and impressment and those things that affected the coastal areas. In fact, the representatives from coastal areas don't want to go to war with Britain. New England in particular, that is very much affected by trade, they're not interested in going to war with Britain. But the South and the West are, and largely because the South and the West was far more influenced by Native American problems that they blamed on Britain, and they assumed would never go away until Canada was brought into the United States. And ultimately, this group of people, the war hawks, is influential enough to push Madison to declare war. And I don't know, we read that. We read Madison's declaration of war. The reasons he stated, and most of the stated reasons for the War of 1812, had to do with trade, with our neutrality, which is interesting. We argued in 1812 that our neutrality was worth fighting for. And like we said the other night, with the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937, we gave away that neutrality. Those things that we thought were so important, we sort of surrendered in order to stay out of another war in Europe. But regardless, in 1912, Madison, primarily indicates that the purpose of the war is to establish America's position as neutral. Now, clearly the intention of this war was to invade and subdue Canada, which people thought would be easy. And if we did the War of 1812, there's not much to it, right? There's not much to it. Madison's objectives are vague. There's an overconfidence on the part of the United States that we can easily take Canada. That does not happen. The United States, in fact, we said, lost more territory than it gained by the end of 1912. Some territory is restored by 1913. But the significant event in the war is that by 1914, Napoleon had abdicated. Napoleon was out of the picture. England was, by 1814, England was interested in sort of making a global peace, and they wanted to end the fighting that was occurring in America, and they launched a three-pronged offensive. They launched a three-pronged offensive in 14. All three of those prongs were repelled, the most significant being the Battle of New Orleans. And even though the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the war technically ended, it was the most significant battle. Because in the Battle of New Orleans, incidentally, who was the commanding general of the American forces? Yes? Andrew Jackson. And one of the significant things, come dear friends, one of the significant things about that battle is that Jackson bursts onto the scene as kind of a national hero since George Washington. But the other thing is that America, faces a regular British army and soundly defeats them, led by Jackson. It leads to sort of a national jubilation and promotes a sense of nationalism that really hadn't been felt prior to that. You know, now we did say this. We did say that the actual war itself had ended in December of 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent. But Jackson nor the British commander at New Orleans knew this. And nor did the Americans know this. Nor did the government know this because of the means of, the speed of transportation. So, you know, when the word of New Orleans and the word of the end of the war came into Washington about the same time, most Americans assumed that we had defeated the British at New Orleans and therefore had won the war. But in actuality, the war ended on the terms of status quo antebellum. Everything goes back to the way it was before the war. And so you could question, you know, what happened? You know, what happened as a result of this war? You know, I mean, you know, did we gain anything? Not really. Not anything tangibly. Did we gain territory? No. Did the British surrender anything on neutrality? Not really, because it was no longer an issue, because there was nothing to be neutral with. Because the war, you know, because the war in Europe was over, there was no issue of neutrality. The Native American problem is sort of dealt with because of the war. You know, Native Americans on the frontier, at least to the Mississippi River, ceased to be sort of a problem, you know, because of the war. So we said the enduring impact of the War of 1812 is sort of the ushering in of this period of nationalism. And we did this. You know, in terms of American history, you kind of have these eras, and I don't know if you're following, you know, the booklet I gave you, where you're at, but certainly you had the constitutional era. By the time the Constitution was adopted, it was adopted in 1788 through kind of the War of 1812, which is 1815, and then 1815 through 1860, you have this antebellum period where you have a fair amount of internal development. Right? It's in this antebellum period. And antebellum means before the war. And the big thing that we talked about in class when we did this is we said, look, during this 45-year period of internal development in the United States, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, right, with the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans, you have, things happening here during this that reflect the spirit of nationalism. And the big tension, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. The big tension here is how does the spirit of nationalism give way to sectionalism that eventually leads to a civil war? And that's sort of a significant question. But nationalism, a sense of nationalism that pervades the country in the aftermath of the war, is evident in a lot of different areas. One is economic. Right? Economic nationalism. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, there is a sense that the United States might need to establish a more self-sufficient economy. I mean, the Jeffersonian vision of America being primarily an agrarian society that would trade with the world for manufactured products was giving way to something called the American system. Who was the architect of the American system? Does anyone remember? Yes, Clay. So Henry Clay says, oh, no. Rather than doing what we had done before, let's move towards an American system. Now, an American system envisioned an economy, an integrated economy on the national level where the Northeast would focus on manufacturing and the South would focus on cash crops and the West would focus on grains and food, and then they would trade with one another. Now, what were the things the government needed to do to implement the American system? We said three things. Do you remember what were associated with words?
High tariffs?
Yes. One of the things that would be instrumental in the American system were high tariffs, or tariffs in general. Let's call them protective tariffs. All right? So, we know that in 1860, with the Republican administration, tariffs, protective tariffs, are passed for the first time. So the burgeoning industrial sector of the United States, which emerged during the War of 1812, in 1816 by Republicans, Tariffs were going to protect that. Besides tariffs, what else was part of the American system? JRRJ, do you remember? Come on, you do. I know you. Just don't say. Go ahead. Good. I know you. Go ahead. Good, buddy. Good job. The American system, yes.
Transportation.
Internal improvements. Internal improvements were also part of the American system, right? Government, nationally government-financed internal improvements, protective tariffs, and lastly, a national bank. Now, from the time Henry Clay orchestrates or promotes the American system until the time he dies in 1852, Clay is promoting this system. Clay is promoting the system of nationalism. Now, what's interesting is this nationalistic vision of the economy, where the national government would promote higher tariffs, internal improvements, and support a national bank, is very much similar to the Hamiltonian vision. Remember, Hamilton wanted a powerful national government that would promote economic growth. Jefferson and Madison feared that such a government would favor some and not others. And they wanted a less intrusive government in which people, the government would leave basically people alone, and that people would farm and do other things, and that the national government wouldn't do anything to protect any one given sector. The American system, if anything, was promoting manufacturing. That's one of the other trends of this time period. This period of internal development included the emergence of manufacturing, the factory system, the Industrial Revolution. We talked about that. We said, look, prior to the War of 1812, American industry was fledgling. There was hostility towards industry. Jefferson and Madison thought that it was dangerous. There was hostility towards urbanization during this time period. Well, what happens during during the War of 1812 is, with British trade out of the picture, you start to get textile manufacturers, you start to get iron manufacturers, you start to get the growth of industry. Now, the mentality is that needs to be protected. And really what you start to see happening in this period is the urbanization and industrialization that really comes to full fruition by 1900. By 1900, America is basically an urban industrial society. When does it start? It starts here, right? It starts here and develops for 85 years. Now, certainly the Civil War kind of gets in the way there. But that happens. Now, in addition to economic nationalism, you also have political nationalism. And the biggest aspect of the political nationalism was the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings. The era of good feelings suggests this, that eventually during this time period, the Federalist Party, the opposition party, ceased to be a viable opponent to the dominant Republican Party. The Republican Party had emerged with Madison and Jefferson, and Madison is going to serve until 1817. In 1816, James Monroe, a Republican, is going to be elected to the presidency. Remember, we said that Monroe was the last president of the Revolutionary Era, that Monroe was the last president of the Virginia dynasty, and that no one opposed Monroe in 1820. In 1820, the Federalist Party, the great party of Hamilton, the party of Washington, the party of Adams, the party that had defended and protected the Constitution, had basically on a national level disintegrated. And the Republican Party, the party of Jefferson, was the single party in the country. Now, there were still Federalists. There were still Federalists in various places, but many of those Federalists, including people like John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, joined the Republican Party. So you have sort of this political one-party nationalism that's called the era of good feelings, during the era of good feelings. And we talked about why that was the case. What happened to the Federalists? Well, one of the things that happened to the Federalists was the Hartford Convention. Does anyone besides Jowsey and myself remember what they... Go ahead, Andrew.
Wasn't it a group of together and file grievances.
So you are saying New England delegates from New England states joined together in a convention, obviously in Hartford, Connecticut, and what were they protesting? Does anyone recall besides the instructor? Go ahead, Chris. Yes, they were adamantly opposed to the War of 1812. In fact, New Englanders defied the federal government during the War of 1812. And the Hartford Convention, what did the Hartford Conventioners want? What did they want? Does anybody remember? Do you remember? Go ahead.
Recall the Oregon?
No, they wanted constitutional protection for their section. Right? They were, now think about this, the Hartford Conventioners, representing the New England states, were fearful that the national government would continue to do things like the embargo and the War of 1812. So they wanted the Constitution modified to protect them. If the Constitution was not modified to protect them, what did they kind of in a veiled way suggest that they may do? Yes, go ahead.
Secede.
Secede. So the first threat of secession by a section of the country that felt threatened by the actions of the federal government is not the Southerners, but New Englanders. Now, the Hartford Convention comes up with some proposed constitutional amendments. They never really actually threatened directly to secede. And when they present their protests to the national government, they do so at the same time that news of the Battle of New Orleans is coming into Washington. And as a result, the Hartford Conventioners and New Englanders in general, and particularly Federalists, are viewed as being less than loyal. That here we have this tremendous victory that the country has achieved. Here we have this sense of nationalism and national pride for the first time. And here these people are crying, basically treason, traitors that are crying about their circumstances. So the Hartford Convention and the protests of Federalists in New England discredit the Federalist Party. Besides the discreditment of the Federalist Party by that, what else hurt the Federalists? Remember we talked about this, we did a practice document-based question on this. Do you remember this? Is anyone besides the instructor? We did a practice, we passed it out, practice DBQ in anticipation of doing a DBQ at the midterm. Does anybody remember what else? Well, look at the board there. The tariff of 1860, the National Bank, government-sponsored internal improvements. What's true about all of those things that were advocated by Republicans? Yes?
They all occurred?
Pardon?
They all occurred?
Well, yeah, they all occurred, but they were all things that had been previously supported by Federalists. I mean, the National Bank was something that Hamilton fought Jefferson over, within Washington's cabinet. Now, the Republican Party had participated in 1860 in rechartering the Second Bank of the United States. Madison, Madison is going to veto some internal improvements, but internal improvements were also things that Adams had advocated. In other words, I know we said this. I know, Ryan, we said that one of the things that led to the demise of the Federalist Party and sort of this political nationalism was that the Republicans out-federalized the Federalists. They did things that, were previously things that the Federalists had supported. And so, given the Republicans were advocating their policies, and given that the Federalists had been discredited, the Federalist Party fades. And for a brief period of time, you kind of have one-party rule. Political nationalism. So we've got economic nationalism, political nationalism, now judicial nationalism. Judicial nationalism comes in the form of the Marshall Court. Who is John Marshall? Who is John Marshall? May I call upon... No. Elaine, may I call upon you to tell the kids who is John Marshall? Oh, he's a Supreme Court Justice. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Joe. Who appointed John Marshall? Anybody know besides Kristen and myself? Go ahead.
Adams.
John Adams appointed him 1801, so he was one of the midnight judges, correct? So he was appointed in 1801 as Adams was leaving the presidency. He was one of the midnight judges. He will serve until 1834. Marshall is a Federalist. As a Federalist, Marshall is going to support kind of this idea of judicial nationalism. The Federalists wanted to build the power of the national government. They wanted to protect, the Federalists were conservatives. As conservatives, they wanted to protect order and stability by building the power of the national government. They wanted to protect private property from the whims of state legislatures and other democratic forces. They wanted to promote business by protecting the sanctity of contracts. And what Marshall is going to do for 34 years as Chief Justice is keep...
Will you custodians please unlock room 1124 for students to get their book? Unlock 1124, thank you.
Is going to keep alive federalism on the Supreme Court. We call this judicial nationalism. The Federalists had a nationalistic vision of the country, so he wants to keep this alive on the national level. Now, okay, right? So the Marshall Court is important. Now, there's a number of Supreme Court decisions that maybe on some level you should know, and I don't even know what to tell you. The book that I gave you, I've got a bunch of Supreme Court decisions to discuss. And one, obviously, is Marbury versus Madison. Just for fun, what does Marbury versus Madison establish? And that's a Marshall decision. That established, you should be able to say, I should be able to say, boom, you should say, boom. See how he did it? I went, boom, he said judicial review. If I said, what did Marbury versus Madison establish? Boom, judicial review. Oh, but now if I said, Kathleen, what's judicial review, what would you say?
The ability of the courts to review legislative decisions inside its constitutional.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good explanation. That's exactly what it is. It is sort of the authority by the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter of the constitutionality of federal legislation. Right? Anybody, just for purposes of trivia, after the Judicial Act of 1789 is deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, does anybody remember what the next act of Congress that was declared unconstitutional was? And what year it was in the U.S. Congress? We said that when Marshall declared the Judicial Act to be unconstitutional in 1803, not another act of Congress had been declared unconstitutional for 54 years.
Missouri Compromise.
Pardon me?
Missouri Compromise?
No, it is Missouri. It was the Dred Scott decision to declare the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. But if in the Marshall Court there were numerous decisions that were made that implemented those things, I guess if I had to review one, it would be McCulloch versus Maryland. Right? It would be McCulloch versus Maryland. And the reason that I would say McCulloch versus Maryland is one of those Supreme Court decisions that you should know is because what was at issue in McCulloch versus Maryland was the broad versus the strict interpretation of the Constitution. So, remember that when Hamilton proposed to charter that the national government should charter a national bank, Jefferson opposed that by saying nowhere in the Constitution does Congress have the authority to charter banks and businesses. Therefore, it doesn't say it, so you can't do it. Now, that's called the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton, on the other hand, said, look, in the Constitution there is the elastic clause. The elastic clause says, why, look, anything that Congress deems as necessary and proper to do the things that they are required to do is therefore constitutional. Or a bank would be necessary and proper to regulate commerce and control currency. And so this debate between the broad and the loose interpretation of the Constitution had been ongoing. Those who interpreted the Constitution broadly, those who interpreted it strictly, had been ongoing. And the question now is, which is right? In McCulloch versus Maryland, what Marshall says is the ends justify the means. If the ends of something is constitutional, all means to get there is constitutional. Because what's at issue in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, is the second bank of the United States? Is the second bank of the United States constitutional? And what Marshall says is yes, despite the fact that nowhere in the Constitution is there anything that says that Congress has the right to charter banks and businesses. It does have the authority to regulate commerce and create, and regulate currency. In order to do that, that constitutional ends. The means of creating a bank is therefore constitutional. So, the state's attempt to tax the second bank of the United States was unconstitutional, and the Bank of the United States was constitutional. That's McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, interestingly, and I know what you're thinking, Doyle, I know you're thinking, but didn't Jackson then later argue again that the bank was unconstitutional? And many of you wrote about that. He did. He did argue that it was unconstitutional, but Jackson argued that he as president got to determine constitutionality. The Supreme Court got to determine it, so did he. Right? He got to determine constitutionality as well. Okay, now, one last thing. So we've got economic nationalism, we've got political nationalism, we've got judicial nationalism. Let's just do one last. How about diplomatic nationalism, or nationalism in foreign affairs? To some extent, the War of 1812 creates an environment where Americans begin to see themselves as a nation, and so does the world. In the aftermath of the war, America will assert itself diplomatically. Right? America will assert itself diplomatically. Now, I guess there are a number of examples of this, but the two that I guess I'd want you to remember are the Adams-Honest Treaty and the Monroe Doctrine. Adams-Honest and the Monroe Doctrine. Adams-Honest is 1819, and the Monroe Doctrine is 1823. So both of those are in the immediate aftermath of the War of 1812, not immediate aftermath, relatively immediate aftermath of the War of 1812. Does anybody remember what Adams-Honest did? Anybody besides the instructor? I have an advantage, being a super genius is an advantage, But does anybody, go ahead, Ryan.
The land, like maybe the border between Canada and the United States across.
No, Adams-Honest is not Canada. It's a little further south. It is Florida and Mexico. All right. The Adams-Honest Treaty is the treaty that ceded Florida to the United States for $5 million and established a border between the Louisiana Purchase and the Spanish colony of Mexico. Now, does anybody remember the context of that treaty? How it came to be? Yes. Yeah, Jackson raided Florida, and they didn't know what to do about it. And Adams responded by saying, look, the Spanish can't control their colony, and if they can't control their colony, we'll keep doing this. And it basically forced the Spanish to sell that territory to the United States. And then Adams was able to establish a permanent border between Mexico and the United States. Mexico eventually became independent, right? And the Texas border was part of that. Now, more significantly is the Monroe Doctrine. Now let me go through the Monroe Doctrine just quickly. The Monroe Doctrine, we said, is one of the pillars of American foreign policy. The first pillar of American foreign policy is Washington's farewell address. Washington, warns the country in 1796, beware of entangling alliances with Europe. We're different than they are. Don't get involved in their affairs. Stay away from it. That's part of it. That's one of the pillars of American foreign policy. The second is embodied in the Monroe Doctrine. The context of the Monroe Doctrine is this. During the Napoleonic Wars, France was unable to hold its New World colonies, as were Spain. Spain had been invaded. They couldn't hold on to their Latin American colonies. France couldn't hold on to their Latin American colonies. And so what you had from 1815 through the early 1820s was independence movements throughout Latin America.
Carol Hoffner, please call 5741, Carol, 5741.
You had independence movements throughout Latin America. You know, Bolivia, Colombia, you know, all these nations asserted their independence. And the United States quickly recognized these countries, as did Britain, and we started to trade with them. So, you know, on some level, the independence of these states was something that we thought was consistent with our own revolutionary history, and on another level, there were economic advantages to not having these countries in an imperial situation with Spain. Now, once the monarchs reestablished power in Europe, there was a fear that they would try to come back and reassert their colonial claims. And what the Monroe Doctrine basically is a warning. It is a warning to Europe that colonization of the Western Hemisphere is over. That the United States will see any attempt by any European power to colonize the Western Hemisphere as a threat to our safety and security. Basically what it says, the Monroe Doctrine, is that the Western Hemisphere is the United States sphere of influence. Look, this is our hemisphere, stay out. Now, the Monroe Doctrine also reiterates sort of Washington's farewell address, where it says, look, your system in the Eastern Hemisphere is different than ours. You know, we have different systems. We have no intention of interfering in yours, and we see any attempt by you to interfere in ours as a threat to our safety and security. Therefore, if you do this, you'll have to fight us. Now, I mean, the United States, when the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed, and it's just a proclamation of one president that has been the policy of the United States government to some extent ever since, didn't have the standing of law, and we really weren't in a position to defend it. But we knew that Britain supported it and that they would defend it. So that the Monroe Doctrine becomes a linchpin for foreign policy. Now, just for fun, I'm going to let you go. Just we said there are three pillars to foreign policy: Washington's farewell address, the Monroe Doctrine, and what is the third? Well, no, that's probably connected to the other three. The open door in China. The open door in China. These tend to be the three things. Now, I'll just to remind me where we start on Tuesday. The last thing I was going to talk about in terms of nationalism, you know, promoting nationalism, was connecting the country together with the transportation network, the transportation revolution. And that's where we'll start. Right, so that's not bad. That was 35 minutes. That's a lot, isn't it, Andrew? That's a lot. All right, it's only 3, it's a little bit later, so I apologize.